So America taxed the aluminum it cannot make, and the price jumped 52%. That is the sentence that should define the trade policy of this era. But it does not stop there, because while American manufacturers are absorbing a 52% aluminum price increase they cannot pass on, cannot absorb, and cannot escape, Canada's smelters are still running. Full capacity. They simply found other buyers. Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom. The aluminum that American aircraft manufacturers, American automakers, and American beverage companies need to survive is still being produced in the same Quebec facilities it was produced in before the tariff. It is simply no longer being sold to the United States. The tariff did not bring aluminum manufacturing home. It could not bring aluminum manufacturing home because the United States, which once operated 16 functioning primary aluminum smelters, now operates 2, not 16. 2. The infrastructure required to replace Canadian supply does not exist. It cannot be built in a year, or 2 years, or 3. And in the meantime, the 52% price increase is not an abstraction in a policy brief. It is a cost on every American factory floor, every auto assembly line, every defense contractor, every American can of soda produced in this country today. Warren Buffett responded to this with the kind of precision that strips away every political argument and leaves only the economic reality. You cannot tariff your way to a supply you don't have, Buffett said. What you can do, and what just happened, is tariff your way to an industry that pays 52% more for its raw material, while its competitors in Germany and Japan pay the old price. That is not protection. That is subtraction. When you hear what actually happened inside the trade advisory sessions where officials were confronted with the domestic capacity numbers, in the purchasing departments of American manufacturers, who received new aluminum pricing sheets they had no framework to absorb, and in the Canadian smelter boardrooms where the decision was made to redirect production to other markets, you will understand why industrial economists are calling this the most precisely self-defeating tariff in modern American history. Hit subscribe because this is not a trade dispute. This is a supply chain dismemberment. And the damage being done is permanent. Let me give you the full context. Because the aluminum tariff did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived as the culminating product of a political argument that had been building for years, an argument that was emotionally compelling, factually incomplete, and economically catastrophic in ways that were entirely visible to anyone who examined the underlying numbers before the decision was made. The argument was this: China has been flooding global aluminum markets with subsidized production for decades, undercutting American smelters on price, driving them out of business, and leaving the United States dangerously dependent on foreign supply for a metal critical to its defense industrial base, its automotive sector, its aerospace manufacturing, and its basic consumer economy. That argument contains genuine truth. China did subsidize its aluminum industry extensively and deliberately. American smelters did close. The dependency is real. What the argument omitted, and what the tariff policy was built upon that omission, is the specific question of which foreign supply the United States is actually dependent on. Because the answer is not primarily China. The answer is a 4-hour drive from Detroit. The answer is the province of Quebec, where a combination of abundant hydroelectric power, sophisticated smelting infrastructure, and decades of accumulated technical expertise has made Canada the single largest supplier of primary aluminum to the United States. Before the tariff, Canada supplied approximately 68% of all primary aluminum imported into this country. That number deserves to sit for a moment. 68% of the aluminum that goes into American cars, American military vehicles, American commercial aircraft, American construction materials, and American beverage containers, 68% came from a single allied country, a neighbor, a partner whose smelters operate under environmental and labor standards higher than virtually any alternative global supplier. The dependency on foreign aluminum that the tariff was designed to address was, in 68% of its volume, a dependency on Canada, not China. Most Americans do not know this. It is, according to sources familiar with the trade policy discussion that preceded the tariffs design, a fact that did not feature prominently in the political framing of the measure. The political argument required a Chinese villain. The operational reality offered a Canadian supplier. The tariff proceeded on the argument it needed rather than the reality it had. The United States, at the peak of its aluminum industry in the 1980s, operated 16 primary aluminum smelters, 16 facilities capable of producing the raw, smelted, refined material from which all aluminum products begin. Today it operates 2. The rest closed over decades, as electricity costs rose, as environmental compliance requirements increased, as the capital required to maintain aging infrastructure exceeded what the economics of a commodity industry could support. The knowledge, the workforce, the institutional infrastructure of American primary aluminum production were dispersed and lost over a generation. Canada's smelters survived that same period for a specific, documented, and structurally irreplaceable reason. Quebec's hydroelectric power grid provides electricity at costs that are impossible to replicate on the continental U.S. grid. Primary aluminum smelting is among the most energy-intensive industrial processes that exist. Electricity accounts for 30 to 40% of the total cost of production. A country with abundant, cheap, clean hydroelectric power has a structural advantage in aluminum that no tariff can overcome, because no tariff can change the geography of rivers or the cost of electrons. You cannot tariff a river. The tariff was announced as a mechanism to incentivize the rebuilding of American smelting capacity, to bring those 16 smelters back, or something like them, and to reduce the 68% dependency on Canada that the defense establishment and the industrial policy community had identified as a vulnerability. What the tariff announcement did not include, because it could not afford to, is what any logistics planner or industrial engineer could have told the policy room in 10 minutes. Building a primary aluminum smelter from conception to commercial production takes between 4 and 7 years under optimistic conditions. A single facility of meaningful scale costs between $4 and $6 billion to construct. The continental U.S. does not have the hydroelectric grid infrastructure to power a new domestic smelter network at costs that would make those smelters competitive with Canadian production. And even if every permitting and construction and infrastructure challenge were resolved at impossible speed, the 52% price increase is happening now. Today, this morning, on every aluminum purchase order being processed in every American manufacturing operation in this country. The gap between the policy's stated goal and its operational reality was not a secret. It was documented. It was available. The question of whether it was carried into the room where the decision was made is the question that defines what happened next. The Trade Policy Staff Committee of the United States coordinates trade positions across executive departments from a conference room in the Eisenhower Executive Office building adjacent to the West Wing. The room is a working room, not a ceremonial one. A long table, government issue chairs, a whiteboard on one wall that has absorbed the calculations of 100 policy decisions over the decades. Binders, laptops, the quiet, practiced efficiency of career officials who have spent professional lifetimes in rooms exactly like this one. According to sources familiar with the proceedings, a session took place in the weeks before the aluminum tariff was formally announced, at which the domestic capacity question was placed directly and specifically on the table, not as a theoretical concern, but as a documented operational reality. The presentation had been prepared by career trade economists. It contained specific figures, the smelter count, the construction timeline, the electricity cost differential between Quebec hydroelectric power and U.S. grid power, the import dependency by country of origin, and the answer to the core question the tariff was supposed to address: how quickly could the United States realistically replace Canadian aluminum supply with domestic production? According to sources present for that discussion, the preliminary modeling suggested that under optimistic conditions, accelerated permitting, committed private capital investment, no material construction delays, existing grid infrastructure, the United States could bring meaningful new domestic primary aluminum smelting capacity online in approximately 6 to 8 years. under realistic conditions closer to a decade. A particular kind of quiet settled over the room when that number was presented. Not dramatic. Career officials in rooms like this have learned to process difficult information without visible reaction. But a specific, recognizable stillness, the silence of people recalculating what they are being asked to endorse. A senior career economist present, a person with more than 2 decades of trade policy experience who had watched previous tariff measures work and fail, asked a question that sources describe as simple, direct, and delivered without apparent emotion. He asked, what does a tariff on Canadian aluminum do to domestic aluminum prices in the period before that new domestic capacity exists, before the 6 to 8 years? In the immediate term, what does it cost American buyers, starting now, before a single new smelter breaks ground? The answer was already in the room. It was in the modeling the economists had prepared. A significant tariff on Canadian aluminum, which supplied 68% of U.S. imports, would drive domestic prices upward by an estimated 18 to 26% in the near term, as buyers competed for a suddenly constrained supply without domestic alternatives to absorb the difference. That was the modeled range at a 25% tariff rate. The tariff that was ultimately implemented was not 25%, it was 50%. According to sources familiar with the design process, the final rate was set through a process that weighted political impact over the economic analysis the career staff had prepared. 50% had declarative power. It sent a signal. It sounded like resolve. The gap between the rate chosen and the rate the economic modeling had examined, and the gap between the modeled price impact and the 52% realized increase that followed, reflects the distance between the political logic of the decision and the operational logic of the market it was applied to. The binders from that committee session exist in an archive somewhere in the Eisenhower building. The calculations in them are still accurate. The timeline is still accurate. The gap between 2 smelters and what American industry requires is still as wide as it was when the first question was asked in that quiet room. The purchasing directors of American aluminum-dependent manufacturers received their revised pricing sheets in the weeks following implementation. Those sheets were not policy documents. They were invoices. A Boeing pricing manager, according to sources familiar with the aerospace sector's internal response, ran the new aluminum costs against the company's forward production schedule and produced a figure that required immediate escalation to senior financial leadership. Not because the price increase was unexpected in principle, because the 52% realized magnitude against planning assumptions built around a 20 to 25% scenario exceeded the envelope the company's near-term program economics had been constructed to absorb. At automotive manufacturers across the Midwest, Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, the response was immediate and arithmetically precise. An aluminum-intensive vehicle like the Ford F-150, which uses approximately 800 pounds of aluminum per truck, had become substantially more expensive to produce without a corresponding increase in the price for which it could be sold. That differential across millions of vehicles produced a figure in the hundreds of millions of additional dollars in absorbed cost per manufacturer per year. Cost that would find its way to the consumer or to the balance sheet or to the workforce, but that would find its way somewhere, because cost always does. Meanwhile, in the smelting facilities of the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region of Quebec, the tariff announcement had produced a response that was, in its own way, the most devastating indictment of the policy's logic that any economic model could have generated. The smelters kept running. They did not slow. They did not absorb the impact or petition for relief or wait for the trade dispute to resolve. They made phone calls. They signed contracts. They redirected shipments. Japanese aluminum buyers, German industrial importers, South Korean manufacturers, buyers who had been sourcing from other global suppliers at premium prices, now had access to high-quality Canadian primary aluminum at prices well below what the tariffed U.S. market was demanding. The Canadian aluminum that American manufacturers needed was not destroyed by the tariff. It was permanently rerouted to buyers who recognized a durable new commercial reality and signed contracts accordingly. The 52% price increase experienced by American buyers was not the consequence of any Canadian action. It was the direct mathematical consequence of removing 68% of American import supply from the accessible market, and discovering, precisely as the career economists had documented in that committee room, that the domestic replacement simply did not exist. The market response was not delayed. It was immediate, specific, and calibrated to the industries that aluminum feeds most directly, and aluminum feeds nearly everything. Aluminum futures repriced within hours of the tariffs announcement, not the contained adjustment of a managed trade measure, but the sharp, sustained climb of a commodity market processing the information that a major supply source has been structurally removed from an ecosystem with no domestic alternatives. The 52% price increase did not arrive as a single-day spike. It accumulated across weeks as buyers competed for constrained supply, as forward contracts came due and were reset at new prices, and as the structural mathematics of the situation became clear to every participant in the market simultaneously. The beverage industry, which produces more than 100 billion aluminum cans annually in the United States, communicated with suppliers and regulators within days of the tariffs implementation. Industry associations issued statements describing the measure as a consumer tax applied to the manufacturing of American-made products. That description was arithmetically accurate. Every American branded beverage packaged in an aluminum can was being produced with raw material that now cost 52% more than it had cost the week before, without any new domestic supply having materialized to justify or offset the increase. In the defense sector, the implications extended from procurement budgets into acquisition timelines. Military programs, the F-35, the next-generation tanker fleet, strategic lift aircraft, use aluminum in volumes that are both significant and specification critical. According to sources familiar with internal defense procurement reviews, formal assessments of tariff impact on contracted program cost structures were initiated within weeks of implementation. Some of those assessments produced figures that required formal notification to the Department of Defense. A tariff imposed in part to protect the defense industrial base had generated documented additional costs within that same defense industrial base, the precise opposite of the stated strategic objective. Canada's commercial response was measured in time and designed for permanence. Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs targeting American exports, agricultural products from swing states, consumer goods from politically visible manufacturing regions. But the more consequential Canadian response was the one that generated no formal press release and attracted no cameras. The systematic, efficient process by which Canadian smelters signed long-term supply agreements with buyers in markets that had no trade dispute with Canada. According to sources familiar with the Canadian aluminum sector, the redirection of supply to alternative markets was largely structurally complete within 90 days of the tariffs implementation. New long-term contracts with standard terms of 5 to 10 years were in place. New shipping logistics were operational. The smelters that had supplied American manufacturers for decades were still running at full capacity. They were simply no longer running for the United States. Leaked assessments from within the U.S. Trade Representative's office, provided by officials who described themselves as genuinely concerned about the direction of the administration's approach, confirmed what the public record carefully avoided stating directly. There was no plan for what happened after the tariff took effect. One source said, there was a rate, and there was a date, and there was a belief that the market would find a way to adapt. The market adapted, just not the way anyone in the room wanted. The economic translation of what August and its aftermath meant arrived from Buffett with the particular clinical precision he reserves for situations where economic reality has been allowed to accumulate damage without being named. Buffett's response to the aluminum tariff and its 52% consequence was built, characteristically, around a single principle delivered without dramatic framing: you cannot tariff your way to a supply you don't have. He said it plainly, he said it repeatedly, and he said what follows from it with equal plainness. What you can do, and what just happened, is tariff your way to an industry that pays 52% more for its raw material than every one of its international competitors. That is not protection. That is a competitive disadvantage imposed by your own government on your own manufacturers. The economic translation was precise in its specificity. In 6 decades of doing business, Buffett said, he had watched companies make many varieties of strategic error, but the one that was most consistently and most predictably catastrophic was the error of confusing the desire for a supply chain with the existence of one. You cannot wish aluminum smelters into existence, he said. You cannot tariff them into existence. They require capital. They require electricity infrastructure at a cost that the continental U.S. grid does not provide. They require years of construction. And they require an economics that makes them viable to operate into the future. None of those things can be delivered on the schedule that a 50% tariff requires them to be delivered. What exists on that schedule is the price increase. The smelters come later, if they come at all. The damage comes now. The historical parallel he drew was to the steel tariffs of 2002, a case he had tracked with professional attention at the time, and that he described as the most directly applicable precedent. The Bush administration imposed steel tariffs of up to 30% in 2002, with the stated goal of protecting American steel producers and incentivizing domestic investment. The World Trade Organization ruled the tariffs in violation of trade agreements. More significantly and more relevant to aluminum, the tariffs were ultimately reversed not because of the W2 ruling, but because of what they were doing to American steel consumers, auto manufacturers, appliance producers, construction companies, all of them paying elevated steel prices while their international competitors paid the old price. The tariffs were reversed after 20 months. The damage to American manufacturers' cost competitiveness during those 20 months was not reversed with them. It accumulated and it lingered. In 60 years of watching industries and markets, Buffett said, I have never once seen a government tariff successfully transfer production capacity from one country to another on the timeline that the tariff requires. Not once. What tariffs reliably, consistently, and mathematically do is raise prices for the users of the tariff material immediately, on the day the tariff takes effect, while the domestic supply response, if it comes at all, arrives years later. That gap between the immediate price damage and the eventual supply response is where the real cost of a tariff lives. And in primary aluminum, that gap is not months. It is the better part of a decade. Buffett connected the smelter count to the philosophical argument directly. 16-2. That trajectory, documented over 40 years, driven by the structural economics of a power-intensive industry migrating toward cheap energy, is not a number that a tariff produced. It is the accumulated outcome of electricity costs, environmental compliance requirements, capital investment decisions, and the straightforward logic of an energy-intensive industry locating where energy is structurally affordable. Quebec has cheap hydroelectric power. The continental United States does not have a comparable alternative. A tariff cannot create a river, Buffett said. A tariff cannot build a dam. And a tariff on Canadian aluminum cannot change the fundamental geographic and economic reality that made Canadian aluminum competitive in the first place. What it can change, and did change, is the price that every American buyer pays. Starting the morning the tariff took effect, at 52% more than the morning before. Then the verdict. There is a word for a policy that raises costs for American manufacturers, reduces their competitiveness against international rivals, and redirects Canadian supply permanently to other markets while solving none of the dependency it claimed to address. The word is not protection. The word is self-inflicted. The consequences of a 52% aluminum price increase do not remain within the aluminum sector. They travel through every supply chain that aluminum feeds, which means through the American economy with a breadth that resists complete inventory. In the automotive sector, the cascade was direct and arithmetically unavoidable. Aluminum-intensive trucks, the F-150, the Silverado, the Ram 1500, became more expensive to produce by amounts that translated across full model year production volumes into hundreds of millions of additional dollars per manufacturer. Those costs were absorbed in layers, partly by the manufacturers themselves, compressing margins on platforms already under pricing pressure from the simultaneous transition to electric vehicle architectures, partly by consumers. In sticker prices that moved upward at rates faster than general inflation and faster than the income growth of the buyers who purchased those vehicles, and partly by the supplier network passed backward through the supply chain to components manufacturers who had no capacity to absorb them either. Cost transfer does not disappear. It compounds as it moves. In aerospace, the consequences were longer in duration and more structurally complex. Boeing's commercial programs are sold years in advance under contracts that embed pricing assumptions about input costs into delivery economics that cannot be easily renegotiated. A 52% aluminum price increase that was not inside those pricing assumptions is not a quarterly earnings problem. It is a multi-year program economics problem. And the defense procurement implications, the cost growth in existing military contracts that the tariff generated, required formal budget notifications and acquisition amendments that moved through the defense system with the slow, grinding friction of bureaucratic process. The detail that concentrated minds inside the Pentagon was specific. A tariff imposed in part to protect the defense industrial base had generated documented formal line item additional costs within that same defense industrial base. That fact required no political interpretation. It was there in the budget notifications. On the political dimension, the geographic specificity of the damage created pressures that the tariffs architects had underweighted. The states most directly exposed to aluminum price increases, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, were not remote from the administration's political base. They were its manufacturing heartland. Congressional members from those states began receiving calls with the same structure as those that had arrived during the 2002 steel tariff period. Calls from major employers whose operational economics had changed, asking when the damage would stop and what the plan was for addressing it. The political cover extended to the tariff approach began eroding in the private conversations between members and constituent employers before it eroded anywhere that cameras could record. On defense and security, the implications extended beyond procurement budgets into the architecture of the alliance relationship itself. Canada's participation in NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that provides both countries early warning and air sovereignty, its role in the Five Eyes intelligence network, and its contribution to Arctic sovereignty and northern approaches made the trade war's damage to the bilateral relationship a matter of concern that military officials had been flagging in internal assessments for months before the aluminum tariff. Defense cooperation operates on the same foundation of institutional trust as trade cooperation. When one dimension of that trust is damaged, the erosion is not contained. The international signal landed with the force of a confirmation. Germany's foreign trade ministry called for a return to rules-based trade engagement. Japan and South Korea, each navigating their own complex trade relationships with Washington, quietly instructed diplomatic teams to analyze the Canadian situation as a case study in what they should prepare for. Australia's trade minister said publicly what allied governments were saying in every private channel. If this is how the United States treats Canada, its closest geographic partner, its most economically integrated ally, its 68% aluminum supplier, then no country can plan its industrial supply chains around American trade commitments. China required no translation. Beijing offered Canada expanded commodity trade discussions within 24 hours of the tariffs implementation, minerals, agricultural products, technology components, moving with the deliberate. Visible satisfaction of a strategic competitor watching its primary adversary generate exactly the supply chain diversification away from American partnership that China had been attempting to create through its own efforts for years. The Canadian aluminum that had previously flowed to American manufacturers was now flowing toward Asian markets, reducing input costs for manufacturers in those markets who compete directly with American producers for global orders. Think about that with full clarity. A tariff designed in part as a counter to Chinese industrial strategy had made Chinese manufacturers' raw material cost position more competitive relative to American ones. It had reduced the premium that Canadian aluminum commanded in Asian markets. It had accelerated the supply chain diversification away from American partnerships that Chinese strategic planners had been working toward. The tariff designed to project American industrial strength had delivered strategic gifts to the competitor it was designed to confront. 68% of American primary aluminum from Canada, 52% price increase, 16 smelters to 2, and the irony at the center of all of it, The policy built to reduce foreign dependency had increased the cost of domestic production, accelerated the permanent rerouting of the supply it needed, and made every alternative competitor to American manufacturing modestly more competitive in the same moment. There is a principle that every industrial economist, every supply chain manager, every purchasing director understands before they understand almost anything else about their profession: you cannot buy what does not exist. You can offer any price, you can impose any tariff, you can frame any policy as protection, but if the domestic supply of a critical industrial material does not exist, if the smelters are not operating, if the capacity is not there, if the infrastructure was dismantled over decades and cannot be rebuilt in years, then the tariff does not protect American industry. It taxes it. 16 primary aluminum smelters to 2. That is the number that defines everything. 68% of American aluminum imports from Canada. That is the dependency the tariff claimed to address. 52%. That is the price increase American manufacturers absorbed instead. 3 numbers. 3 realities that were documented, modeled, and available to every person in the room where the decision was made. Buffett said it with the arithmetic plainness that defines his particular authority: you cannot tariff your way to a supply you don't have. What you can do is tariff your way to an industry that pays 52% more for its raw material, while its competitors pay the old price. That is not protection. That is self-inflicted. The Canadian smelters are still running, full capacity, in the same Quebec facilities that have supplied American manufacturers for decades. The aluminum is still being produced. It is simply no longer coming to the United States. It is going to Japan, to Germany, to South Korea, to buyers who recognized what the tariff had revealed about American trade reliability and signed long-term contracts accordingly. Contracts with 5- and 10-year terms. Contracts that were not signed in anger or in retaliation. They were signed in the calm, rational, commercial logic of buyers who looked at the new reality and made permanent decisions based on it. 16 smelters to 2. 68% dependency. 52% price increase. And Canada's smelters still running full capacity for someone else. The tariff is still in effect. The contracts in Japan and Germany are still accumulating months and years. The gap between 2 domestic smelters and what American industry requires to function is not closing. It is widening. As the alternative supply relationships that Canadian producers have built become more embedded, more infrastructure-backed, and more permanent with every quarter that passes. The rebuilding of American smelting capacity, if it comes, will have to reach further to find the ground it started from, because that ground has been given away truck by truck and contract by contract to buyers who needed a reliable partner and found one that the United States had made available. The 52% is still on every invoice, and the smelters that were supposed to replace it are still years from breaking ground.
आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार का। आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार का। मुस्कुरा के बात करती हो, आदतें खराब करती हो, ना दिखो बेताब लगता हूँ, आशिक बेहिसाब लगता हूँ। ऐसा नशा है तेरे दीदार का, आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार का। जिंदगी हसीन लगती है, जब ये जालिम प्यार होता है, सांसों में सांस आती है, जब तेरा दीदार होता है। नखरा है ऐसा मेरी सरकार का, आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार का। नखरा इसका टॉप पर आती है टिकटॉक पर, नैनो से है नैन मिलाती, लड़कों की है दिल जलाती, पिंडी में है चर्चा इसका, नीरा जितना खर्चा इसका। मैंने बोला इसको मेट्रो में बिठाऊंगा, कैपिटल ले जाऊंगा, F7 भी घुमाऊंगा, मोनाल भी दिखाऊंगा, सेंटोरस भी ले जाऊंगा। आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार का। मौसमों की बेकरारी को आजमा के जान जाओगी, हिज्र की आजमाइश में एक दिन पहचान जाओगी। कहना है मेरे दिल बेकरार का, आशिक हूँ तेरा राजा बाजार का, लगता है मुझको नशा ये प्यार।